Administration has blasted back against that NBC News exclusive report yesterday about Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's private fury about his treatment at the hands of President Trump. The report says Tillerson was on the verge of resigning this past summer, which sources say led to an intervention by Vice President Mike Pence and other high-ranking administration officials. There was also the assertion, backed by 3 sources, that Tillerson openly disparaged the president, referring to him as a moron after a July meeting at the Pentagon. Tillerson made a surprise announcement before the press yesterday and then engaged with reporters, something he rarely has done since taking office.
The Vice President has never had to persuade me to remain as Secretary of State because I have never considered leaving this post. I serve at the appointment of the President, and I'm here for as long as the President feels I can be useful to achieving his objectives. Let me tell you what I've learned about this President, whom I did not know before taking this office. He loves his country. He puts Americans and America first. He's smart. He demands results wherever he goes, and he holds those around him accountable for whether they've done the job he's asked them to do. While I'm new to Washington, I have learned that there are some who try to sow dissension to advance their own agenda by tearing others apart in an effort to undermine President Trump's own agenda. I do not, and I will not operate that way. And the same applies to everyone on my team here at the State Department. President Trump and his administration will keep moving forward as one team with one mission, doing great things for the United States of America to make America great again.
Did you address the main headline of this story that you called the president a moron? And if not, where do you think these reports or
I'm not going to deal with petty stuff like that. I mean, this is what I don't understand about Washington. Again, I'm not from this place, but the places I come from, we don't deal with that kind of petty nonsense. And it is intended to do nothing but divide people. And I'm just not going to be part of this effort to divide this administration.
Listen carefully. While Tillerson did not personally issue a denial of calling the president a moron, later in the day, his spokesperson did.
The secretary does not use that type of language. The secretary did not use that type of language to speak about the president of the United States. He does not use that language to speak about anyone. So I hope that clarifies it.
He never said
He
that.
did not say that.
Mike Barnicle, there are a lot of different ways we can look at what Rex Tillerson did there. Some people will look at it and say, oh, it's shameful. I'll tell you what I saw, and I suspect you probably saw the same thing too. That was not a guy that was quivering, nervous at the podium, going, oh my God, I hope I get this right, or else I'm going to be fired, because as we talked about yesterday with Andrea Mitchell and David Ignatius, he doesn't care. He's an independent force on his own. He doesn't like the job. He doesn't need the job. He's doing the job because he thinks he loves his country and believes he needs to serve it, whether people think he's doing a good job or not. I saw a guy, though, yesterday who certainly, and this is all speculation, but based on knowledge of how he works in Washington, certainly talked to James Mattis, and I'm sure talked to General Kelly, and at the end decided, you know what? Okay, guys, I'll stay here. I know, as Bob Corker said, I know that we may be the only people standing between, this president and even more chaos.
Yeah, Joe, that was a thoroughly humiliating performance by Secretary of State Tillerson, forced to stand up there, and literally it's as if someone, Joe, you and I have sat next to one another for 10 years, and if you want to count Scarborough country, 12 or 13 years. So it's as if someone asks me.
Well, yeah, I mean, why would wait, hold on, why wouldn't you count Scarborough country? Those are the most important years.
Those are true.
No passport required, only common sense allowed. What do you mean? You just put an asterisk by those glory years of American television.
Like
God.
So
That's kind of like telling Paul McCartney you've been playing music for all these years, and if you want to count those 7 or 8 years you played with the Beatles, it's even longer, but go ahead.
So, someone says, tell me about Joe Scarborough. And I say the following. Let me tell you about Joe Scarborough. I've known this man for 13 or 14 years. He loves his country. He puts America first. He's smart. I mean, if Rex Tillerson had the relationship with the President of the United States that you would hope that a Secretary of State would have with the President of the United States, he wouldn't be reading off a script to describe that relationship. He would know it.
Right.
He would live it. And we now have an age. Carol is here. Richard Haas is here. Caddy is here. They can all speak to it, especially Richard Haas. We are now part of a problem where usually it's the House or Senate Democrats complaining about policy differences in an administration. But now,
Right.
it's policy differences as being banged back and forth between the President and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's crazy time.
Man, it may be, but I say thank God that none of them and Nikki Haley are not parroting the Steve Bannon wing of the White House and actually are talking sense. Carol Lee, let's talk about your reporting. First of all, I just got to say, with Mike Barnicle, bouncing off what Mike just said, I think it's humiliating, actually, to the President of the United States, because everybody knows that Rex knows that your reporting's right. You've got it. And I'm not just saying that because you're here. We all know that happened. You've got all of the sources, and yet the President of the United States can't fire the guy. For some reason, he's still there. This time 24 hours ago, I'm sure a lot of people didn't think he was going to be there. But talk about the story. The president tweeted out attacking your story. Everybody was attacking your sources. What can you tell us 24 hours later?
Well, I can tell you that we certainly stand by the story, and this was a story that we extensively reported. We talked to a dozen people for this story. There were 7 independent senior administration officials who said that Rex Tillerson indeed intended to resign this summer, and despite what the secretary said yesterday. And we spoke with 3 separate senior administration officials who said that the Tillerson called the president a moron. Some of them overheard him actually say that. So, you know, this is not some fake news report. And the thing about the president's tweet that, look, if he were to admit that this story is accurate, which it is, then he would have to fire Rex Tillerson. There would be no other choice.
Right.
And I think right now it's just kind of a waiting game. How long does Rex Tillerson stick around? How long does Donald Trump put up with this? But even if he does stay around, he's sort of, you know, he's almost like, he's not going to, it's hard to see him being effective, and this relationship is not likely to at all to be repaired. You know, it's been rocky. You have, and part of that is because you have this sort of CEO versus CEO. You have 2 people who feel like they've always been in charge. They've always called their own shots, and you know, President Trump doesn't like to have checks on his authority, whether it's Congress or courts or his own aides, and Tillerson doesn't much like to be a subordinate. And that has been kind of a disastrous recipe for this relationship. And, you know, which Richard Haas can speak to this, but it's America's foreign policy is stuck in the middle of all of that.
Yeah, and you know, Richard, there's also something else that generals have that sometimes CEOs do not have. It depends on how a CEO gets to the top of the corporation. But all generals begin as lowly grunts, and they spend a good bit of their careers having to be obsequious to the person above them. And certainly, not obsequious, but you'd certainly, sir, yes, sir. So by the time you become, you know, a 2-star general, a 3-star general, you've been around the block and you've figured out how to work within a chain of command. So it's not quite as hard for Secretary Mattis or General Kelly to deal with a difficult superior as it would be, say, the CEO of ExxonMobil.
Fair enough, but I think it's also fair to say, Joe, that people like the 2 generals you just mentioned had a career in government. I think it's awfully hard to go from corporate America and think that the skill set that worked for you there transfers into government. It doesn't. We've seen it not just with Rex Tillerson, but others. Paul O'Neill, when he was an unsuccessful Secretary of the Treasury. And we could spend time, for example, questioning the Secretary of State's focus on reorganizing the State Department at a time the world is unraveling. But I think the bigger issue is the president. And in order for any Secretary of State to be successful, the world cannot see daylight between him and his boss. People have to believe that when the Secretary of State speaks, he is the authoritative voice of the United States. And whatever else you think about Rex Tillerson, no one in the world can possibly think he is the authoritative voice of the United States, not when he's meeting with Chinese officials and the President of the United States is tweeting that he's wasting his time and that diplomacy has no place here. So unless the President is going to enable Rex Tillerson to succeed, he cannot succeed. So the real question to me, and Carol put her finger on it, is not how long he stays in the job. It's not whether he resigns. It's whether this president is prepared to make Rex Tillerson or his successor viable. And unless you back him up, unless you cool it on the tweeting, unless you give him the resources, unless you approve all the personnel, unless you fill American embassies with ambassadors, unless you think hard about the role of others at the White House who are detracting from the authority of the Secretary of State, no person in this job can succeed. That's the bottom line.
Well, a few things, Richard, though, in this administration, and we talked about it just a minute or two ago, it's not just Rex Tillerson. I mean, there's daylight between Secretary Mattis and President Trump on the Iran deal. There's daylight between Rex Tillerson, of course, and the President of the United States on North Korea. There's daylight between Nikki Haley and the President of the United States on everything from news, sports, and weather to you name it, on just about everything. It's from the very beginning, Nikki Haley has been running what most people have assumed has been an independent foreign policy that is traditionally Republican, but bears no resemblance to what the President of the United States is saying. And Richard, I just wonder, again, whether we are looking at a good cop, bad cop routine, where we heard leaks over the weekend that the president was telling everybody, just relax, I'm being the bad cop, and all of these subordinates are being a good cop. I mean, Mike Pence on Russia. Mike Pence talks like Ronald Reagan when he's in the Baltic states. He says exactly what you or I would want this administration to say. At some point, 8 months in, it can't be an accident that all of these policy leaders inside the administration are towing the same line. It just happens to be a line that's different from the president's bluster.
The difference there, Joe, is good cop, bad cop is choreographed. I don't think there's anything about this that is choreographed. The National Security Council process, the interagency process, isn't working. I'm not sitting here criticizing H.R. McMaster. He simply doesn't have the authority. The president is not willing to subject himself to the discipline of orderly governance. You have too many cooks in the kitchen.
Richard, do you think that, Richard, if the president didn't know that the Secretary of Defense was going to say on the Hill a couple of days ago that it was in America's best interest to still adhere to the terms of the Iran nuclear deal, don't you think we would have already heard about that battle brewing? It happens every day.
Yeah, I don't think this president wants to take on this Secretary of Defense. And also, the Secretary of Defense has troops in the field. He's got military and people in uniform staffing the Pentagon. Right. He's in a much stronger position than the Secretary of State, who simply doesn't have that bureaucratic or resource base. And I just don't. I think this president is wary of taking on General Mattis or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, who both have come out in support of the Iran agreement. Rex Tillerson is flying much more out there solo, and he's made it worse on himself. Granted, he's got a bad hand, but I think he's played it badly. He hasn't staffed up his department. He hasn't fought for resources. His focus has been on tertiary issues like reorganizing the State Department rather than going out there and creating a national and international consensus on behalf of what foreign policy he thinks the United States ought to be conducting.
All right, we have much more to talk about on that topic. And thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.